handing it off to Hayden to get us started tonight.
All right, great. Thank you, Joe. Well, this storm, the Superstorm in 1993, definitely had it all. Blizzard conditions in unusual places such as the Deep South, high winds, coastal flooding, a significant, devastating storm surge, severe weather, tornadoes. I think what's most remarkable about this storm was the large area of the eastern United States that was impacted by this. It resulted in 25% of airline flights canceled nationwide on Saturday, March 12th, which is just incredible. Approximately $2 billion in property damage across 22 states. One thing I really remember about this, I was in high school, and I'll never forget, I was eating in a restaurant with my parents and grandparents, and up on the TV, the forecast was potential blizzard day 4, day 5. It's something you don't really see today. That era we're talking about 30 years ago, the accuracy of this forecast was just incredible for that time period. There was one element, and it was a significant element that was missed, and we'll discuss that in a bit here. All right, so we do have a few poll questions here. And Joe, can they just select from those under the tab there?
No, I will get it started. So let's see. And okay, there you go. So the first question is, do you remember the March Superstorm of 1993? Hayden said he was in high school. I was just starting my career in the Weather Service, and we'll talk a little bit about that, some of my experiences in Binghamton, New York. So it looks like pretty good majority here say yes. Looks like we're around 80% yes, 20% no. All right, let me see. I'll close it and I'll give it another minute here. Looks like we got a few coming in late, but
yeah, it looks like it's hanging around 80%.
Yeah, so let me go
4 out of 5.
Yeah, let me go ahead and close it so everybody can see the results. I'm pretty sure this is how this works. Let's see. And let me see. Share. There we go. All right, so you should see it right there. So we've got 79% at yes and 21% as no, and I'm guessing the 21% are some younger folks with us tonight, which is fine. That's okay. So let's go to the next. We have one more question. So if you do remember this storm, and let me see, is it showing up? Yeah, there we go. If you do remember it, what was the really the most memorable part? Blizzard conditions or snow? Kind of a loaded question. Maybe the strong winds, or how about the severe weather in the south? That was really a big deal with the storm, and Hayden will talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, I know, kind of a loaded question, Hayden, but we figure we'll ask it anyway.
Just depends on where you were.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, we have people actually from outside of New England who attend these, so you never know. I know we have some folks in the Carolinas, Minnesota, I've heard from, so we'll see. It looks like responses are slowing down. Okay, I'll go ahead and close it. So it looks like by far, 83% of you say the blizzard conditions and snow, which is no surprise. That was the main impact up here. Followed by the 13% with severe weather in the south, and then 4% on the strong winds. There really wasn't much coastal flooding with this. I believe it occurred at the lower of the high tide, so the surge really didn't do too much, which was a good thing because it could have certainly been a lot worse. All right, so with that, Hayden, I think we are good, and you can go ahead and continue. So thank you.
Yeah, great. So this is a look at the snowfall from the Superstorm in 1993. And what's obviously unique about it is just how far south the significant snowfall was, extending into the Florida Panhandle. And basically blizzard conditions from Birmingham to Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, we're talking mid-March, not even midwinter. And this is extremely rare to unprecedented for that to occur. And the mountains of the Carolinas and into West Virginia just got hammered, and you could see Syracuse 42 inches, Albany 26.6 inches, Worcester at 20 inches. Now on the I-95 corridor, we'll talk about this. There was a transition from initially heavy snow to sleet and some rain, which kind of held accumulations in that 8 to 14 to 15 inch ballpark. But for that era, we were in kind of a quiet era for for snowstorms. It may not sound like a huge event as to what we've seen over the past 20 years in this area, but back then it kind of was for quite some time, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides here. So talking about wind as well, Boston gusted over 80 miles per hour, and what was unique about this storm, the winds were somewhat further inland than we often see in a lot of our nor'easters. So you know, basically getting winds close to 50 miles per hour into western Massachusetts. And also you're having these strong winds extending well down into the south. And you could see that by Jacksonville, Florida, very strong winds into the Carolinas. And that's something you don't see too often with what we call an extratropical storm. That means non-tropical. So usually when we're talking about big winds or a storm surge, we're talking about a tropical system in the south. That's how they usually get that type of wind and type of coastal flooding, and that's what made this storm so unusual. So at the time, Hurricane Andrew, remember in 1992, you know, a devastating Category 5 hurricane that went into South Florida, obviously, you know, with horrible devastation to that area. This basically were, you know, barely a year later, and tremendous property damage, $1.6 billion. And 1/3 of the storm-related deaths were in Florida. We had not only severe weather, tornadoes, but we had an unprecedented storm surge, which we'll talk about coming up here. And there was a tremendous amount of damage across the entire Southeast, all the way into the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast states. While we weren't impacted quite as extreme, it was still very significant. And that's what made this storm so unique too, just the amount of area it covered across the eastern United States. It was just such a tremendous storm. It was huge and expansive. So the storm was not a surprise, as I talked about. It was incredibly forecasted for that era. I just remember, you know, day 4, day 5, folks not only mentioning a potential blizzard into parts of the Northeast, but into the deep South. And that, again, that is just so unusual to be talking about, you know, potential blizzard for, you know, Atlanta, Birmingham, and those areas. The one aspect of this storm that was not well handled was the unprecedented storm surge off the Florida Gulf Coast. And the reason for that is there's been nothing of this nature up until that point. All the significant storm surges were the result of tropical systems, hurricanes. This just wasn't something that forecasters could relate to at the time. And Florida, again, the hardest impacted state from this storm, just because they had every weather you could imagine. Several inches of snow in the Florida Panhandle, strong winds from the low pressure system itself, severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, and then the big thing was the unprecedented storm surge that came up along the Gulf Coast and resulted in fortunate fatalities because that water came up so fast and so high, considering it was a non-tropical system. So again, unprecedented storm surge of 9 to 12 feet. That's something that you're thinking about in say a Category 1 hurricane. So that's just how extreme it was. It was not well forecast. At the time, there was a lack of tide gauge observations. The modeling wasn't anywhere near what it is today. I'm very confident if somehow we had an event like this today, we would have really handled this storm surge quite well, and there would have been evacuations ordered for these areas, and a lot more lives would have been saved. But again, this is just such a unique storm. In addition to that, we had the tornadoes coming across to the south of the low pressure system, across Florida. There were 2 F2 tornadoes. And the thing about Florida is while they get a ton of thunderstorms, the most in the United States, they're usually south of what we call the main jet dynamics, where those strong winds are at, say, like airplane level. And that's what really tends to cause severe weather. So they do get tornadoes, but often their tornadoes are really short-lived and weak. And, two F2 tornadoes, it's not unprecedented to get that, but the way these form from this big, rapidly intensifying low pressure system was quite unusual. And you can see the damage photos on the lower left there. So in addition to the tornadoes, we also had a squall line with winds over 60 miles per hour. A lot of trees were knocked down. Unfortunately, there were 5 fatalities, and that was separate from the actual coastal flooding, that unprecedented storm surge that actually occurred northwest of that location, especially into parts of the Florida Panhandle and the western coast. So looking further north into Georgia and in the Carolinas, again on the coast there, wind gusts at over 80 miles per hour, thousands of trees snapped, uprooted, 500,000 customers left without power. Again, there was tremendous coastal flooding on the North Carolina Outer Banks from the southwest winds. All that water just piled up, and many people needed to be rescued in trapped vehicles. Several homes were flooded. 2 construction barges broke from their moorings. So this wasn't just a blizzard. It's easy to kind of remember it that way, especially because snow captures a lot of our attention. And those that can remember also saw the incredible photos, the 42 inches of snowfall in Syracuse, just incredible snowfall amounts, and into the Georgia and North Carolina mountains. But the flooding from the storm surge in parts of the area, such as the Carolina coast, the southwest portion of Florida there, were just incredible. And, into the Appalachians, it was an all-out blizzard from northern Alabama into northern Georgia, West Virginia. This area was second hardest hit behind Florida. High winds with more than a foot of snow and wind chills down to 20 below zero. Thousands of downed trees, widespread power outages, and numerous snowfall records fell. These were 24-hour records. Beckley, 28.2 inches, Huntington, 21.8 inches, and Charleston, West Virginia, almost a foot and a half. So an incredible amount of snow, and it was accompanied by strong winds that produced blizzard conditions and obviously bitterly cold wind chills. Record cold wrapped in behind this storm, which made the recovery even more difficult. And looking further north, as we got into the Washington, D.C. to New York City area, basically we had a blizzard just northwest of that I-95 corridor, as we like to phrase it. In the cities itself, there was a big thump of heavy snow on the front end of this. Again, on the order of, say, 8 to 15 inches, but the snow did change to sleet and rain in the big cities. It did end as a period of snow on the back side of it. And as we talked about, we had record cold wrapping in behind that. So we kind of had everything freeze over. So that made the recovery difficult. Schools were closed 3 to 4 days. I think I remember, so the storm was on a Saturday. I was home from school Monday and Tuesday. So the recovery took some time. There were strong winds, produced beach erosion. And again, as Joe talked about earlier, the strongest winds didn't coincide with the high tide, and then they kind of blew offshore, which spared our region the real significant coastal flooding. And into upstate New York, they were in an all-out blizzard. Again, places 3 to 4 feet of snow. Roofs collapsed. It was just a major blizzard for that area. Strong winds damaged the roof of an elementary school. There was damage all across, upstate New York. And again, this area is accustomed to big-time lake effect snow, but this was a different type of event. Some of the snow, it was it was heavier, and it was just accompanied by a tremendous amount of wind. It just snowed and snowed at 2, 3, 4 inches per hour for 24 hours. It was just incredible snowfall rates. And looking into our area in southern New England, we did, border with blizzard conditions onto the I-95 corridor, but you just got west. That's where the all-out blizzard was, where we had, around 3 feet of snow in the higher elevations. The Cape only had 2 to 4 inches. They quickly changed over to rain. Now, we talked about this earlier. Boston had over a foot, which is a big storm. But if you look at some of the storms we've had in Boston over, the past 20 years, it seems like every 2 years or so, we're dealing with 18 to 24 inch type of an event. But this era, the 1980s leading up to this, was a relatively quiet in terms of snowfall across a lot of the I-95 corridor. So this actually was the biggest snow in Boston and Providence and Hartford in a decade, going back to what was the blizzard of 1983, the February 11th, 1983 I-95 blizzard. So that's pretty remarkable. The high winds were actually stronger than in the December of the 1992 nor'easter across New England. For those who remember that one, that brought tremendous coastal flooding to the region. But again, in this case, fortunately, that was the one thing we were spared because the winds were of relatively strong duration and did not coincide with the high tide. The winds have to line up right at the high tide for those really big impacts to be felt. Unfortunately, in this case, that didn't happen. So looking at the analysis, we're looking at 500 millibars here. So think of it where if you're going, 25, 30,000 feet up in an airplane, that's kind of where we look as meteorologists to kind of dissect the atmosphere and kind of envision what might happen. And you can see tremendous what we call digging. That's when you get a big trough to develop and merging of energy. So you have a northern stream piece of energy and a southern stream piece of energy. And if they're timed just right, they merge together and form, in this case, a big storm. And you can see that big cutoff low pressure system developing towards the deep south there. And that would actually lift northeast. And that's why it impacted so many people, because it developed in the Gulf of Mexico and then lifted northeastward. And it basically impacted everyone, the eastern third of the United States, with significant impacts. And cold air in place across much of the eastern United States supported snow all the way down into the Florida Panhandle. And again, this is, doesn't happen in the wintertime, let alone mid-March. But a lot of it is hinged on, say, the track of the storm system. So it may be hard to imagine, well, how's it going to be snowing in the Gulf Coast of Florida and then raining, say, in Portland, Maine? Well, winds blow counterclockwise around low pressure. And in this case, the low pressure tracked too close to the coast. So that allowed a period of warm air to slide in off the ocean with those very strong east winds, which flipped all the I-95 corridor cities over to a period of sleet and rain. And actually, a lot of the areas dry slotted, which means the precipitation got really light. That's why a lot of the snow didn't melt, because it wasn't completely washed away by heavy rain in a lot of cases there. And again, this is a look at the track of this low pressure system here. And you can see how that really hugged the coast there, tracking up across New Jersey, Philadelphia area, and then just pretty much over the Boston area. So places near and east of that actually got pretty warm. I think Jersey may have gotten into the 50s, and Boston may have taken a brief run at 50, close to it at Logan. But if you got 5 or 10 miles west, it was a lot colder. So those small differences in track can make a huge difference in the specific outcome. And one thing you may hear us talk about are Miller A versus Miller B. Miller A storms, they tend to form in the Gulf, and they can infect a much larger area. In this case, the entire eastern United States. Miller B storms, they tend to form off the Carolina coast or even a little further north. And so those impacts are tended to be confined to, say, the Northeast, especially as you get north of, say, New York City. That's where the impacts from those are usually felt. Given our climatology, we're susceptible to both storms. That's why we can get hit really hard if we have enough cold air and the storm tracks are right, say, in the winters of like 2014, 2015. I'm sure a lot of you folks remember that one. And one thing we look at a lot as meteorologists are the soundings. And basically that's a look at, say, the temperature, dew point, and wind profile all the way up, say, through 100,000 feet of the atmosphere. We're used to seeing what's the temperature at the surface, what are the winds. And one thing you'll notice in these soundings, this was 7 a.m. Saturday. So the snow was just moving in to the region. And you can see, like, you have southerly flow in the mid-levels of the atmosphere in Atlantic City. That's transporting that deep moisture. And then you have easterly winds there at the surface. So that's allowing all that rich Atlantic moisture to get involved with the storm system. And that's why places that did change to rain ended up with over 3 feet of snow. And then this is at 7 p.m. So the heaviest snow had already ended across a lot of the coastal areas. And one thing that happened is, look at Atlantic City. The black line on the right is an indication of your temperature, and the left is dew point. And notice what you'll see. Remember we talked about a dry slot? Notice this big area of dry air just off the surface. That's because the storm tracked right over that area. So they were kind of left with very light rain, not much going on at the time. But when you look over to the left in the Albany sounding, they're far enough to the west that they never dry slotted it. They just kept getting pounded with snow, hence 2 to 3 feet or even more of snow in those areas. And then this is a look at the soundings from 7 a.m. Sunday. What you'll notice now, we're on the backside of the storm. As you can see, both soundings in Albany and Atlantic City, the winds have shifted to the northwest. So there was a period where a lot of the I-95 corridor shifted back to snow. But usually what happens is the winds, when they turn northwest, they also bring in a lot of drier air. So usually the transition on the backside of the storm, you don't get a ton of snow. You usually get most of it on the front end, unless there are unique circumstances. But this was typical, and the brunt of it was over. And you can actually see in Atlantic City this large difference between the temperature at the surface to the right and then the dew point line on the left. So that's that dry air coming in. Where Albany, there's still a lot of moisture on the back side of the system because they were far enough west, and then you get the lake moisture that spills in as well. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Joe, who was just getting his National Weather Service career started. And at the time, we were kind of going into modernization, and there were a lot of changes going on. So he's going to take it from here.
All right. Thank you, Hayden. And yeah, so we've talked about this in some of our other presentations, like the blizzard of 78. So back even up through the early 90s, we were in still our older structure, which consisted of what were known as larger weather service forecast offices, such as the one in Boston, and then what are known as smaller weather service offices, which provided pretty much local forecasts and warnings. So those in southern New England were at Hartford, at Bradley Airport, Worcester, Providence, and Chatham. And these offices took observations and kind of provided localized information for the cities where they were. So where I was in Binghamton, we were a weather service office under the forecast office from Albany. So we took the forecast from Albany and localized them for Binghamton. We also took weather observations at the airport. Radar, we had a radar observations there as well. But we were just getting into the beginnings of the modernization where some of the offices were kind of combined. So, for example, the Boston office moved to Taunton, and now we're in Norton. But we kind of combined the smaller offices in Hartford, Worcester, Providence, and Chatham all into one. And the Binghamton office was spun up into a larger office along the lines of the Albany and Boston offices. So that's kind of where we are today, where we have these weather forecast offices, where each office produces its own forecast for its area of responsibility. So back then it was a little bit different. So I just wanted to kind of put that into context where we kind of were. And certainly there was no internet back in 1993. We're still a few years away from that. And we had an old system which was known as AFOS, which is there on the lower left as Blue Monster, we used to call it. And it really just had very basic model data. It was all in black and white, no colors, not a lot to look at. And in the middle here, you see some fax charts. And we received a lot of data by fax as well and posted those maps up on the wall. That's how we received a lot of our information, either on fax or through this AFOS system. And even on the right, this is the observation console. So this is where we took our weather observations. I'll try and point out what's on the console. They're all pretty much similar. We had our temperature here, our dew point. This is our wind direction, wind speed, the altimeter, which is essentially the barometer. We had a gust recorder here, which followed the wind speed. We also had different graphs for precipitation. The barometer was located actually up in here. It's in a little cylinder. So a bunch of different instruments that most of them were located somewhere out on the airport, wherever the office was located. And that's where we took our weather observations from, recording all of that data. Now, today, as you see up here on the top right, this is our office in Norton. We have much more sophisticated models and platforms. We use a system called AWIPS today. And we use, this is how we produce our forecast, receive all of our information. And of course, information is freely available on the internet. So we've certainly come a long way. But the early 1990s, it was still, Hayden, you were lucky you were in high school. There wasn't a heck of a lot to look at back then. But, we made it work. So back in 1993, what models were available? And there were some of the ones we have today. In the U.S., we had what was called the MRF, which was our medium range forecast model. So think about that as kind of our GFS of today. And along the lines was the aviation model, which was out to 72 hours. Again, those two models essentially are what we have in the GFS today. The UK Met model was available. The ECMWF model was available. We actually had the Canadian as well. And some of the regional models we know today, such as maybe the NAM. A little bit different. We had one called the LFM, which debuted right around the blizzard of 78, believe it or not. Then we had the NGM, which was the main model through the 1980s and early 1990s, the nested grid model. These models were run twice per day, so not 4 times a day, but only twice per day. And we only received really limited 4-panel data sets, either by fax or in that system I mentioned called AFOS. And you were really limited to what you see there, the surface. And then we went up to 850 millibars, like Hayden showed, 700 millibars, which is around 10,000 feet. We had our 500 millibar level, about 18,000 feet or so, and then 250 millibars, which is your jet stream level, up close to 39,000 feet. So there's an example of one of the panels there on the right. So if I can remember what these all are, you'd have your 500 millibar on the top left, your surface here on the top right. I believe, Hayden, I can't read it too well, but I think that was the 700 there, and then we had our precipitation on the bottom right. So it's that's pretty much all you would get, and at 12-hour time steps. So we're not seeing data at 6-hour time steps or 3 hours or even hourly like we have today. It was 7 p.m., 7 a.m. That's all you kind of had to work with, and you kind of interpolated in between. So
yeah, and I think you're right, Joe. That is 700 millibars.
Yeah, I made the image too small. My fault. So, but yeah, that was kind of the standard. And I remember, you'd sit on the fax waiting for these things to come in, and they would slowly come in, and you're trying to see the 500. Oh, look at that! And it was definitely an adventure in forecasting back then. So here's some snapshots, and they might be a little blurry, but bottom line is these were the medium range forecasts 4 to 5 days in advance, and it might be hard to kind of make it out, but the low that you see that's really wound up is right over essentially New York City, southern New England. So we have the U.S. MRF model here, the European looks like it's a little bit off the New Jersey coast, and the UK Met is a little bit further north. But boy, I mean, all three models were in very good agreement. As Hayden mentioned, that's why people were talking blizzard in the media 4 to 5 days in advance. Up to this point, this had really never been seen, this kind of agreement, and especially on the storm location and intensity. So we were kind of entering a new era of beginning to provide good lead time on winter storms. And in the shorter range here, also, very much accurate forecast following up from the medium range guidance. You can see this was, 36 hours in advance when the storm was over the deep south, but you've got, a pretty well structured low pressure system over, it looks like Georgia, South Carolina on all three models. And as you know, we don't have all the images, but as this went forward in time, it really showed a strengthening low pressure system moving right up the I-95 corridor, and really helped us, get the word out in advance of the storm, especially up here in the Northeast. So in Binghamton at the time, we were doing some what we called local forecast discussions. As I mentioned, we were in our process of spinning up to become a full-fledged forecast office. So a lot of us would write a local forecast discussion. It would be actually sent internally to the forecasters in Albany, so we were kind of on the same page. So this was Thursday, March 11th, and Hayden, I think our warning coordination meteorologist at the time was working shift, and he puts in here, this is Thursday, now for the fun, Saturday looks to be the interesting day. All three models placed low near Georgia at 12Z, which we just showed. You've got a large tongue of 90% RH humidity as far north as the southern tier, which was those first row of counties in central New York. So, but he said, looks like two problems will limit a potential monster. The system moves too fast, according to the aviation model, from Georgia to New Jersey in 12 hours. Also, things aren't phased too well. So there still was a little bit of uncertainty there. But as he wrote, I think the next two models will clear up things, and it certainly did. So the next day on Friday, here we go. Let the fun and games begin. All three models bring the monster, which he wasn't believing the day before, into our area by, this is 0Z Sunday, so 7 p.m. on Saturday. And, little doubt now that we're gonna get it. So coordinating with Albany and Buffalo, which was the other forecast office, they were going with blizzard warnings for Saturday afternoon and night. And keep in mind, nowadays, if we did a blizzard warning the day before, that's pretty typical. Back then, it had never been done. Blizzard warnings were only issued right, essentially when the storm was beginning. So to issue these on a Friday afternoon for a storm that was really not going to ramp up until Saturday afternoon and Saturday night in central New York, it was unprecedented. And I remember, working that afternoon and saying, hearing that they were going to do remember the old emergency broadcast system, which was the precursor to the emergency alert system. They would have the tests on TV all the time. New York State actually activated the emergency broadcast system for this storm based upon that blizzard warning. And there was a lot of phone coordination with Albany, Binghamton, Buffalo, the Syracuse office, the Rochester office as well, to make sure we were all on the same page. So again, something that was just completely unprecedented, it was pretty amazing to be working, up into the storm and during it too. So at this point, we were pretty much locked in, 24, 30 hours ahead of time. This was going to be a really significant storm for much of upstate New York. And then as you can see, I found one of my old statements. This was Thursday afternoon. We're talking, again, 2 days before. Nowadays we definitely have watches up at this point. Here we're just putting out a special weather statement saying, hey, there might be a storm this weekend. And I do remember the winter up there was pretty busy. It was pretty snowy up in upstate New York, either from lake effect or for some storms that pretty much hugged the coast and brought the heavier snow, well inland across upstate New York. But, on Thursday, we were already getting the timing in pretty well. Heavy snow begins in that area Saturday afternoon, which it did, and continue into Sunday, which it did. We're talking about strong northeast winds and, getting people ready. And then Friday morning, the watch went up. So keep in mind, we did the warnings Friday afternoon. The watch didn't go up until Friday morning. Again, having a watch 24 hours was pretty typical back then. Nowadays, it'd be, probably at that point, Thursday, I would say at the latest, it would be up. But talking about the combination, you can read here, heavy snow, strong winds, making sure you're checking on your supplies. We kind of knew this was going to be a big one. and it certainly was. And then going through, as I mentioned, blizzard warnings were issued about 24 hours before, and this really was unprecedented. And here's, I guess, one of my statements too, Hayden. This was Friday afternoon when the blizzard warnings went up. We had, this was again for the central New York area. Potential for 1 to 2 feet of snow, and at this point, we're just saying, yeah, it's going to be huge. We were making preparations at the office, for staffing, which I guess Hayden it wasn't as much as we had now. We just had 3 people working back then, but that was enough to get the job done. But
Yeah, so different back then. It's incredible.
yeah, what really all we had, we did the hourly weather observations at the airport. We did what were called radar observations on, essentially using a grease pencil on an old radar scope. And we did our local forecasts and statements like this, and that was, media calls too, but it's Binghamton. We didn't have a lot of media there. I think one newspaper, a couple of TV stations. But that was it. No social media, certainly no smartphones or internet. So it was kind of nice to actually work this storm because you could kind of enjoy it in a way, even though it was really, really long. And just getting into a little bit more, here was one of the forecasts that I issued Saturday night when we were well into the snow. Snow lovers, you probably would love to see a forecast like this. And, so we use pretty strong wording, and I have to say, I don't think I've ever used this kind of wording since, Hayden.
Yeah,
zero
wow.
visibility, extreme blowing and drifting snow, thunder and lightning. And we did have thunder and lightning too. But look at this total storm including 2 to 3 feet with drifts up to 10 feet. I mean, that's just crazy. And this is, central New York, not even anywhere near the coast. So, notice the temperatures too. We were, in the teens Saturday night, falling into the single numbers on Sunday behind the storm. And then, we were down below 0 Sunday night, only in the teens on Monday. And this is mid-March. You don't really expect to see this kind of cold. It was really, kind of an impressive storm, and certainly one of the top storms I've worked in my career. Definitely the longest shift I work, and I'll get into that in a minute. So as I mentioned, during the storm, we issued what were called short-term forecasts along with our radar summaries, and really there wasn't much to do, just drawing a big circle on the scope. I remember it was just snowing everywhere, and we tried to time the heavier snow coming in Saturday morning. You can see we had an inch of snow in Binghamton at the airport between 9 and 10. So the snow was just getting in. Most of it was really in the afternoon when the winds picked up as well. So, not really, too much stuff to worry about. And then Sunday morning, I was still there. Our temperature dropped to 7 degrees above 0, which broke our record low for the date, which was the year before. Interesting. But then we had some records too. 24-hour snowfall record for Binghamton, 7 a.m. Saturday to 7 a.m. Sunday, just about 19 inches. And that broke a record back from 1971. And actually had our highest amount of snow on the ground at the airport, 33 inches. I've seen more actually in my house in Norwood, Hayden. I had, I think, 44 back in 2015, but that was still pretty good. And that broke a record way back to 1969, or tied it, which was pretty impressive. And at that point, up to 7 a.m., we had most of the snow. It was a little over 20 inches. We ended up with just over 22. So really for Binghamton and central New York, a lot of the snow was Saturday afternoon, and then was a good, 18 hours. It snowed really well into Sunday morning, and then eventually tapered off. And, we were able to finally get out of the office Sunday afternoon once the roads were cleared. So how about here in southern New England? Well, as luck would have it, Walt Drag was working ahead of the storm. So, and I love it. I love going back to these discussions. Hands. You're definitely in good hands. So this was Wednesday, March 10th. So we're at least 3-4 days ahead of this storm. And so Walt puts, in my opinion, this following scenario should unfold. But it's interesting because they were already, talking to FEMA, MEMA, which is Massachusetts Emergency Management, over the NAWAS, which is our hotline phone, which we still have today. So they were briefing FEMA, on March 10th, which is awesome. That's just amazing, Hayden, to see that.
Yeah, the other thing is, it was, that type of coordination with emergency management agencies and FEMA. It wasn't done like it is today. So
right.
For it to be done,
it was pretty rare.
Several days in advance for it basically, and when it was done, it was usually for tropical systems.
Right. Now the interesting thing too was there was an ongoing event on March 10th. So Walt was kind of waiting. Tonight's storm is the first order of business. he said, we're going to wait for this event to clear out, and then, we'll deal with that, which was pretty typical back then. But the interesting thing was, even Wednesday, he was forecasting a 3 to 4 foot surge. And I think, the high tide was a 10.7 at Boston. So, I mean, that's going to put you potentially over 14 feet, which anything over 14 at Boston is a big deal. So, but
Oh
again,
yeah.
as he mentioned, timing is important. So it was the timing that ended up, saving their bacon a little bit and really prevented, much worse flooding from taking place. But the potential really was there. And boy, I'll tell you what, Hayden, Walt was all over this. I mean, that's just
Yeah, he was.
very
He sure
typical.
was.
Very typical, and great forecaster in Boston. So here's a couple more discussions, and you can look through these, as you like. Classic East Coast bomb, Saturday evening, and this was my favorite line: "Numerical weather prediction modelers around the world deserve the credit." That's great, because this really, as we mentioned, was one of the first big successes for weather models. Now today we kind of take it for granted, even looking out to day 10. But back then, it didn't happen very much, even a couple of days ahead of time. So, um, they were doing what's known as the hurricane hotline. They would use that for winter storms. So the phone hotline that was typically used up and down the East Coast for hurricane coordination was also used for winter storm coordination when you had a big one like this. So they were doing that. Um, you know, they're talking about the storm track still being uncertain, and you can look through some of that yourself. But just pretty interesting to see, all of the thoughts that were going into this, and it's looks like Walt has, an interesting coincidence brought to my attention by a private forecast service. The fifth consecutive month of a storm on or about the 13th of the month. Good thing they were all Fridays, so we had a little bit of fun back then too. And notice in Montana, 500 millibars, minus 41, Hayden. That's pretty cold. That was like,
Yeah, that's about as cold as you really get.
yeah.
500
So, and
millibars.
that's what was coming behind this system. So there you go. Um, and in this, getting a day later, he ran a 3 foot surge and got some minor flooding. Again, that was based upon the timing along the coast of Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So, it wasn't looking like a huge deal at that point based on the timing. Going into Friday afternoon, Superstorm, blizzard to sleet and rain to ground blizzard. So also here in southern New England, the blizzard warnings went up Friday afternoon. Coastal flood warnings were up, and can't really add anything to the models. The damage appears to be done on the leading edge, like Hayden, like you talked about. That's really was the biggest part of the storm. The entire region may see stronger winds Sunday on the backside than on the front side. That's kind of interesting. And this is the most extreme storm potential I have ever worked in winter. I don't want to hold back. Now, for Walt to say
That's
something
great.
like that, his career went back to the late 70s, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's very telling. Very, very telling. 6 to 18 inches of snow likely in most of southern New England, except possibly southeast Mass. Really good. And in those days, this was a coordination message for those smaller weather service offices. So Walt's relaying to the smaller offices, make sure you have your spotter systems activated, your extra staffing is getting in place. It is in a hurricane. Many people, it's unexpected with some of the backlash wind that he was concerned about. And the Great England Windstorm. Hayden, I don't know I'd have to look that one up, but
Yeah, a couple years back. Yeah, I'm
91
not
it must have been.
sure.
Wait, we even got you on this one? That's amazing.
Yeah, I don't know which one he's referring to
Whenever
there.
I need to know a storm, I go to Hayden. He knows
Uh,
them all. Yeah.
the great, yeah, New
The
England
Great
winds.
England Windstorm. We'll have to look that one up, or yeah, that might be interesting to look at. And then here we go. He's of course hanging in the office Saturday night now, and at this point in Binghamton, we're just getting hammered. I mean, I remember the visibility was down near zero by this point. We're just riding it out in the office. At this point, they had terminated the blizzard warning from Watch Hill to Chatham, so the low was over Worcester that evening, or 6-7Z, so it was coming in. So remember the inland track a little bit. They were concerned about Narragansett Bay and Buzzards Bay for severe coastal flooding, but it didn't end up being panned out. And at this point, talking about things like the dry slot, moving through. But This was pretty funny too, Hayden. Would you please look at that ob at Bradford, Pennsylvania, 7 p.m. Gust 42 knots, 12 degrees and 34 inches. Oh yes, 1/16th of a mile in heavy snow. Hello, greenhouse effect. I don't think I would do that today, but yeah,
No, I
back then.
think we get some phone calls.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, had the gust of 81 miles per hour at Boston, as we know of so far. So, and later that evening, it's a wild ride. Wanted to emphasize by satellite imagery, but while the worst is over, if you let your guard down, you could get burned or trapped in a drift or without heat. Still could see serious addition of power outages Sunday with that wind. So I'll tell you, he was all over this, Hayden. I mean, I would
Yeah,
expect that from Walt, but I mean, this was
it
really, really
was.
good. Good
I
forecast.
think it was remarkable, like how, close they got this with, where they terminated the blizzard watch. I guess because they put a watch because there was uncertainty. If it went a
Right.
little further east, you could have had a blizzard, right on even southeast of the I-95 corridor. But I remember the forecast, like, growing up in Philadelphia, it was very accurate, and it basically said that, Philadelphia, you know, could probably get around a foot of snow and change to rain and sleet, and they were right on that.
Yeah. I mean, in upstate New York, it was easy. It was just snow. So it wasn't
Yeah.
too bad and, a lot less to worry about. And just to show, behind the storm, we mentioned record cold. Well, yeah, check this out. So Monday morning, so this is, after 6 degrees at Bradley. It was, oh, that's not the right. Oh, yeah, that's the right date. March, 2 degrees in Worcester. Boston down to 12 degrees. This is all Monday morning, and even Providence was down to 11. So, and that's Kevin Kadima, who's one of our lead meteorologists today. I had to keep his name in there. So he was working in Providence at the time. So I'll have to tease him about this. But yeah, it was pretty frigid behind us. Remember, again, mid-March, single digits and teens. That's, a pretty rare thing to actually happen. So that was pretty impressive. And then for me, yeah, here on the right, this was me after working my shift. My wife took this picture when I got home. So it was 31 hours. I remember I had a 6 to 2 shift on Saturday. We knew we weren't going home. So I packed my bag and brought everything and worked through till 1 p.m. Sunday. The snow did wind down Sunday morning, but it took a while for them to clear the roads. And actually, when I left the office, I think it was around 1 or 2, the roads were perfectly clear and it was very drivable, but there was a state of emergency. So no one was on the road except if you had to be. And it was really strange because I had about a 20-minute drive from the airport to where I lived, and there was nobody out at all. I mean, going even past like a shopping mall, nothing. So it was pretty cool to work this storm. I think I slept like 2 hours during the night. It was kind of fun. It was just a lot to kind of watch. And as I mentioned, we did weather observations, radar observations, the statements and forecasts. And we also did the NOAA weather radio broadcasts, back in the day. We did them ourselves. So there was that to do. And Hayden, this is probably true. If we had the storm today here at our office, easily need to double the number of staff.
Yeah, with social media, the phone
Yeah,
calls, the different types of briefings we do now.
exactly.
There was a fraction of that back then.
Yeah, I mean,
So
just, between the 3 states that we serve, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, we will be doing a large scale conference call for the entire area, but participating in their state conference calls, probably with FEMA, also with like Mass DOT, we do them. The MBTA is another one. Some of the governor's offices as well. Obviously, social media, you have to have probably 1 or 2 people monitoring that. Storm reports too, getting those out. So my guess
it's
is, yeah, I was going to say, my guess is on the mid shift, the overnight, we probably would have easily what, 3 or 4.
yeah. I mean, it
Yeah,
probably would be. It would a storm like that would come close to like a staffing for like a tropical storm,
yeah. And for that,
tropical
we're
storm
doing like 5,
hurricane.
6, yeah, 5, 6 people. Definitely on
Yeah,
the
and
day shift. Yeah,
I think one of the differences too is in the models that, I mean, you guys had to work from was pretty minimal. When you had basic fields and you ran
yeah,
like twice a day. Now we have a lot more model data. I mean, it's incredible, and some of the near term ensemble data that we have. There's so much data that you're looking at so much too. It sometimes, I think what might have made it a little more easier too is you were able to kind of sit back, look at the things that you had and then kind of reflect back on it.
Yeah.
Whereas I think now you're looking at so much model data because you don't want to miss anything. And overall, that's, I think, obviously the forecasts are much better, but you do lose that ability to kind of sit back and take it all in because you don't necessarily have the time, especially when you have like a really big event like that, a historic event.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good point. You had a little more time to, it was more pattern recognition, I think, more than anything else, and not the fire hose of data that we have today. But yeah,
Exactly.
I think we still have that newspaper too, Hayden. It's somewhere in the,
Oh, that's
I think my
great.
wife
Yeah,
saved it. Yeah,
you should bring
yeah.
that in.
I just remember we lived in an apartment, and I remember getting home. It was luckily the lot was plowed, so I pulled right in. But in front of the door to get into the building, it was completely drifted over. It was about a 5 foot drift, and at that point, I'm like, the heck with it, and I just ran right through the drift, and I came in covered in snow. So, and then I just crashed on the couch, and she took that picture of me. So there we go.
Yeah, that's great.
So, all right. So that is our look back at the March Superstorm. We can pause here and we'll look for some questions and then get on to our weather briefing. So let's see. We got a bunch of them. Let's see what we got here. How would you compare? This is from Ronald. How would you compare the Superstorm of March '93 with Superstorm Sandy of 2012? Ooh, you want to take a stab at that, Hayden?
I can try.
Yeah.
I it is kind of difficult to compare, say, a tropical system to um something of like a major winter storm. I mean, obviously, Sandy was a huge event, but in terms of like I think area that was covered by um the Superstorm of '93, plus the variety, the just tremendous variety of weather, in terms of having like blizzard conditions, you know, severe weather, a storm surge that was viable from like that was equal to what a category 1 hurricane would be, and completely unprecedented in the Florida coast, the blizzard in the deep south. I think just the magnitude and the area that the blizzard '93 covered, it's difficult to compare. Where the Superstorm Sandy was obviously just a devastating storm. It was more concentrated in a specific area, I
Yeah.
guess is how I would kind of
Yeah.
sum it up.
Yeah, two different types of storm, but yeah, both, very high end, high end storms in their own respect. So, yeah, good question, Ronald. Let's see. My friend Fred says a friend of his who worked at Smart Traveler in traffic agency, you remember Smart Traveler, sent him a fax on Monday before the storm with NWS suggesting a major snowstorm. Oh, interesting. I went back. I didn't see anything in the forecast discussions, but it's possible they were communicating some things prior to that. So, interesting, Fred. So it was even the Monday before. Let's
Yeah,
see.
I
Yeah.
think so, because I remember it was like day 4, day 5 that was being really highlighted. So a
Yeah.
lot of the storm was on a Saturday for New England.
Interesting. Oh, and Jonathan's, yeah, my buddy Jonathan's chiming in. He's our big snow hound now that Rodney's out of the area. He had a date with a broadcast meteorologist who had to cancel to put in a little OT. But hey, given the snow thumping on steroids, it was worth it. Awesome. I love it. Love it. And Fred has also worked the storm for Newton Auxiliary Police and was one of the worst storms he worked in 25 years. Wet, heavy snow. Yeah, I believe it. And Jonathan also mentions in Boston, the glacier lingered until late March. Yeah, I believe that too. It was cold for a little bit while following the storm. So great. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. So